I'd just like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers. We'll hear more about them shortly, but just to welcome Antonia Ogundaiyisi, Tom Stibbs and Millie Kerr, and I'll introduce them properly when it comes to their time to speak. So, by way of introduction, this webinar is being hosted by the British Association of Social Work Norfolk branch. And we're very grateful to them because that's allowing us to deliver this for free. So no one has to pay to attend these sessions. And that has gone for all of the webinars in the series. Now, this is the final one in a series of 3 events, which has been organised by the British Association of Social Work Children and Families thematic group, which I co-chair, in response to the National Child Safeguarding Review Panel report, which had the title, It's Silent, Race, Racism and Safeguarding Children. Now, I'm sure everyone here on the call is well aware of this report, which came out about a year ago. And in the first of these webinars, which was in October, we were fortunate to have its main author, Janine Davis, here to speak to us about it. Now, for many in the sector, this is one of the most significant reports to have come out in recent years. And most people, we certainly felt it demands a response. And therefore, we wanted to hold a series of events, not only to highlight the report's findings, but also to provide an opportunity for people to share and explore the good work that is being done in so many areas in relation to anti-racist practice in child safeguarding, but also to identify what needs to change, to provide a platform and momentum for building on that change into the future. So it's our hope and intention for these events to be starting a continuation point to contribute to the transformation of children's social care to address the issues identified by the report. So before we get started today, just to quickly recap the first 2 webinars as a reminder. Our first in October, we heard not only from Janine Davis on the panel report, but also from Millie Kerr, who will be speaking today as well, who's strategic lead for anti-racist practice in Brighton and Hove. And she introduced some of the conceptual and methodological foundations for the work that she and colleagues are doing in Brighton. We also had a presentation from Dr. Carleen Cornish from the University of East Anglia, who, drawing on her African knowledge and South African child protection experience, introduced us to the Sawubona practice model, which implements professional values of equality, empathy, dignity, tolerance and respect. And then in the second webinar in November, we heard from thought leaders and practice leaders in anti-racism and anti-racist practice in different local authorities across the country, including Hackney, Essex, Durham, and our friends in Brighton and Hove, about journeys that they have been on, the challenges they've faced and the successes they've achieved. And today what we want to do is build on those often quite inspiring and thought-provoking stories and initiatives to consider how we can sustain and further develop anti-racist practice in our areas and organisations where we are. What are the conditions on which further progress depends? And how can we draw on the knowledge, experience and expertise of those places that are maybe further ahead on their journey so that people don't feel overwhelmed or isolated with the scale of the task, but rather supported and part of a wider movement. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Antonia Ogundaiyisi. Antonia is a qualified social worker who is dedicated to social justice and advocating for racially oppressed groups. She's worked across the public and voluntary sectors and currently oversees Essex County Council Children's Services Anti-Racist Practice Strategy and leads anti-racist initiatives across the eastern regions. Thank you ever so much, Antonia, for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. I think what BASW are doing in terms of continuing this discourse is really important. Sometimes these topics can be discussed on a one-off, but to see that continuation of anti-racist practice conversations is really awesome. So it's great to be here. My name's Antonia Ogundaiyisi. As Rick said, I'm a service manager for anti-racist practice at Essex County Council, and I'm just going to really focus today on what is needed in terms of organisational buy-in and how do we move beyond platitudes, statements and one-off declarations to an actual embedded systemic approach to anti-racist practice. Thank you. So just a bit of background into my role. So my role was created in 2022, and it was actually sparked by the murder of George Floyd, as a conversation starter about what does racial equity mean in Essex? What are the experiences of Black, Asian, dual heritage, social workers and children across the county? And I'm going to come on to explain it in more detail, but it's really about providing strategic and systems leadership around racial equity. And the main duty that I've had to do is really develop a 5-year anti-racist strategy and to provide oversight and quality assurance over that strategy. Thank you. Before I take you on our journey, I'm just going to explain some of what we've done so far. If you press another click, thank you. One of the first things that we did when the role came to life was really establishing an anti-racist practice governance board, and that is made up of senior representatives across the county. And the reason why we approached it in that way was to ensure that governance, accountability, power was really held over this work, to ensure that it did not sit with only people of colour, to ensure that it was part of the fabric of how children's services run. And that governance board is held on a bi-monthly basis, and it's sponsored by one of our directors to ensure again that accountability is really there. And one of the first observations when I came into Essex County Council was that we had a colourblind approach. So we didn't actually see race. We didn't talk about race openly. Racial discourses was not normalised, and there was a lot of fear around just talking about race in general. So we created prompt sheets to help people with conversation starters to ensure that when they are going on home visits and asking questions about race, they are well equipped, that they're able to practice it and talk about it in supervision, so that confidence is built. Again, establishing clear ethnicity labels. Prior to 2022, there wasn't a mandatory option to actually record ethnicity. Our ethnicity categories weren't distinct as well. And I always believe that if we really want to respond to racial inequity, we need to be precise in who we're talking about. So we now record ethnicity as a mandatory task for all social workers, and we split it into different categories. Our work has also gone beyond Essex Children's Services, as we have engaged with partners such as police, health, education, because we recognise the systemic nature of racism. So we began to realise that we cannot solve it only within children's services. We needed to engage with our partners as well. Global majority spaces. So these are spaces where practitioners and leaders can come together from the global majority to talk about their shared experiences, to have that safe space to really talk about strategies and healing methods from racism. And we also hold a quarterly meeting with directors. So directors are held to account as well, so that our global majority staff can hear from directors about what differences they are making, how they're driving and sponsoring anti-racist practices as well. Learning spaces continue to be at the heart of what we do to ensure that we're always talking about race, that we're not allowing it to come off of the agenda, but it is naturalized in our discussions as well. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have also expanded this work across the Eastern region. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in May 2025, we held a kind of inauguration conference where we launched an anti-racist practice pledge across the Eastern region, which is made up of 11 local authorities. And we're really pleased to see 11 directors of children's services sign up to this pledge and say that they actually want to create an anti-racist Eastern region. And a task and finish group made up of senior representatives across the Eastern region came together to articulate what we want to be, where we want to be in 5 years time, 10 years time, and really use that collective weight of the region to drive this. It cannot sit with one person or a role or even one local authority. We really need that collective backing, and that's why I'm really glad to see what BASW is doing today, because it's that national perspective on anti-racism and not just about an individual or a local authority. Thank you. So I'm just going to take you to the beginning of the journey. So 2022 to 2020 in May, we witnessed the horrific murder of George Floyd. And, oftentimes we do reference that point as this kind of racial reckoning, but we know that Racism did not start with George Floyd, and it has not unfortunately ended with George Floyd's murder. There are many, many examples in the UK of systemic racism, but it was a stop pause moment because of COVID. And what happened in April the next year was we had a group of service managers and a director who were all from the global majority, who were really convicted and really hurt and pained by what had happened, and they wanted to be change makers, looking to Brighton and Hove to see what other local authorities were doing. They came together to create a business case, and they wanted to create a role that really focused strategically and systemically upon anti-racism. And the business case for my role was put forward to senior leaders, and it was approved. And if you click on the next one, thank you. And in January 2022, recruitment started. And in April 2022, I became into post, and that's when the anti-racist program launched. And between 2022 and 2024 and 5, we have been really focused on developing a strategy, which you can find on the website. Hopefully someone can help me put it in the chat, and that really gives you an outline in terms of the 4 key pillars in which this work is focused upon, which is practice, leadership, policies and procedures, and the workforce. And that is continuing until we become part of LGR, which is local government reform, which is underway. Thank you. So building governance, so the funding for this role actually came from Children's Transformation Board, which is a board that really focuses on innovative projects. So, our service managers and our director took this to our senior leaders and said, we want to do something different. And the role was approved via the Children's Transformation Board, who received updates about how the role and the agenda was making a difference to children and young people's lives. And as I mentioned, there was an establishment of the Anti-Racist Practice Steering Board. And we also have now an Anti-Racist Practice Working Group made up of diverse practitioners, white, Asian, dual heritage, Black practitioners, and service managers coming together to really think of problem solve around issues of practice and development. So for example, we had a disproportionality thematic audit completed by our quality assurance team last year. So this group is really thinking about how they can respond to the findings of that report and keep it on the agenda. Thank you. So organisational buy-in, I was thinking really carefully about this because anti-racism has to start with self. It has to start with a personal conviction. You have to feel compelled that we don't want to see the world continuing on in how it is. We know that there's so much going on in the world, but until we change, nothing else changes. So it actually starts with a personal conviction, a personal transformation. So it really does start with hearts and minds. It's about us thinking about our agency. How can we be the difference we want to see? How can we make the difference to children and families? And I think for me in Essex, I've seen that it started with this group of service managers who came together and said, something has to change. We have to do something very differently. Through their kind of compelling move, they were able to speak to senior directors who then felt compelled. Senior directors were able to speak to their colleagues who were then compelled. You can sort of liken it to everyone passing on a form of inspiration, challenging each other. And through there, you see that there's a coalition of people who are willing to be change makers coming together from all different backgrounds, people who remembered why social work was important to them, people who remembered why they did the degree. And through there, we've been able to establish, really forms of coalition to respond to this wicked problem of racism. And that third image that I put on is really about the fact that this journey is for the long haul. It's not about a person. It's not about one role. It's about everybody coming together to contribute in whatever way that they can. It starts with reading books, listening to podcasts that that respond to the problem of racism. It starts by normalizing uncomfortable conversations and leaning into them. It starts by even sending an email to your DCS and saying, these are my observations. Can we chat about what we can do as a system? And it starts really with an idea. And organizations must be in it for the long haul. It cannot be a tokenistic one-off endeavor. It has to be a continuous pursuit, and recognizing that it's systemic. So through small groups of coalition, it's about inspiring other groups and then inspiring other groups. As I mentioned, we started in children's services We've now been able to work with the police, also with health, and now across the region. So it's about how do we share that learning and keep it alive, really. Thank you. I've put everything into this article because I thought it would just be easier. So it's an article on the British Journal of Social Work, which really talks about Essex's journey. And I've found that transformational leadership is a philosophy that can be helpful for social work leaders. This talks about the fact that when we change, our organizations change, and there are limitations. Sometimes there is active resistance to this work, but how do we continue? How do we get back up again? And not saying that we have to bear that emotional burden, but it's about how do we not stay in a place of despondency, but always maintaining and centering hope. Thank you. Thank you. And I think I'm just on time. And we've come to the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much, Antonia. That was such an insightful perspective on, especially governance and structures needed to develop and embed an anti-racist practice model in Essex, and the importance of securing organisational buy-in from across the council and influence beyond the local authority into the region. So it's a hugely impressive body of work. So we have allowed time, purely because of people assimilating and probably wanting to ask a few questions about what you've done in Essex. We have about 10 minutes. So if anyone wants to put a question or comment for Antonia or a reflection in the chat, that's fine. Or do put your virtual hands up, and you're free to join the discussion. Let me have a look. I'll give people a minute just to have a think about it. In the meantime, while people think of questions, I've got one, Antonia. I think that perhaps, I mean, it's quite ambitious, isn't it, to go beyond the local authority and develop a regional strategy. How far on are you with that, or do you think this is just the beginning of sort of the unknown almost?
Yes, absolutely. It's very much at the beginning stages. So we only launched in May 2025. So what we've done is establish task and finish groups, regional anti-racist forums to ensure that we have that continuous structure to bring local authorities together. And one of our starting points is creating a regional baseline diagnostic report to see where each local authority is at, and not to condemn any local authority, but to actually share that good practice and come alongside local authorities to support them on their journey.
Yeah, and those are some really, really helpful, practical, concrete suggestions for people who are interested in doing the same thing. Sarah, do comment.
Yeah, thanks, Antonia. That was really, really motivating to listen to and insightful, as Rick said. I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about two of the initiatives, which I think you mentioned that sound really, really important. One was these sheets to support practitioners with questions. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about how you developed those and how in practice, I don't know how long they've been in use now, but how's it playing out? And secondly, you mentioned a group that was for learning and reflection, both for managers and leaders. And it would be really interesting to listen a little bit to the type of issues that colleagues are bringing to those groups. Thanks.
You're very welcome. So I'll start on your second question. So we have leadership spaces which occur on a monthly basis. Those are facilitated by service managers, and we are really intentional to hold that with service managers so they can role model and really lean into gaining that skill around talking about race. So the topics that come are, how do you start conversations about race? The evolution of language. We know that language is always changing. How do we stay up to date? The specific experiences of South Asian children, the specific experiences of Black children. So really try to be really precise. We also look at how to record ethnicity, how to ask the question about ethnicity as well. We've actually looked at the strong Black woman schema, how does that play out in the workplace, and so forth. Adultification has been a topic. Yeah, so they're very, very diverse topics as well. Again, what does it mean to be white, which is a question that isn't often asked or explored. So we really try to create those spaces to continue racial discourse. In regards to that prompt sheet, so when we did our practice interrogation to see the experiences of Black, Asian and dual heritage children, we realized that people weren't asking a question about race, or if a child said they experienced racism, there wasn't actually a good enough response from the social worker. So we felt that, you know, if we create this prompt sheet that allows people to have questions in their back pocket, they are well equipped, they can go out and to home visits, having practiced how to ask. If they don't deal with that discomfort outside of that home visit, for example, via supervision, then it will spill out into practice, it will spill out into interventions as well. So really supporting with that prompt sheet. So the prompt sheet really has examples of, it has definitions of language. So what does white privilege mean? White fragility mean? What does race even actually mean? So those kind of things. And we also have different sections. So for those who have migrated, what does it mean to, what was your experience like migrating? Language, you know, how do you prefer to be spoken to? We ask about young people's experiences with the police. So it has different questions, and I believe they are available for purchase, but I would need to double check how to actually share that. But I'm happy for anyone to contact me if they wanted to more information about that.
They just sound so positive because they're just about getting the discussion started,
Absolutely.
aren't they? And letting people tell their story and making sure that that story's valued. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Great. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'll read them out. If anyone wants to put their hand up and ask it themselves, probably better than I will be able to, please do feel free. Well, we have a question from Georgina Collins, who says, I'm wondering how the threat to equality, diversity and inclusion works similar to US perspectives, that whether the question of whether the right wing in the UK affects the sort of chances for success and sustainability, I suppose, for those initiatives. Interesting. We did hear from the second webinar from Ray Adai and Durham, County Durham, where obviously this is part of the context they're dealing with there. But yeah, any reflections from the Essex context?
Yes, absolutely. I think this work has always been in a challenging political climate. I think no matter what government is in place or is due to be in place, this has always been a topic that has been scrutinized. It's been a topic that has been attacked. But I think it's about remaining steadfast to the mission, which is to dismantle systemic racism. So I think we cannot be discouraged or dissuaded or stop in the midst of that. And we just have to continue, not only for ourselves, but for the generation to come. So yeah, to answer that question, it is difficult, but we have to remain steadfast and keep on going and not give up. It's very important.
Georgina, did you want to add anything?
No, it was really just a thought, and that, yeah, things are becoming more challenging. And I guess, yeah, of course it's important to stick to the mission. I was just sort of thinking about it more widely, really, because it could get worse. Yeah, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Millie, did you want to come in? Sorry, that's probably.
I just wanted to add that, hi. I just wanted to add that I was doing some training yesterday for a big organisation that works with children and families and fostering and adoption. And a question around this came up, really around far right and around some foster carers in this particular area where reform were also now part of the council, that there were some foster carers who were now fearful of looking after children who were from asylum-seeking separated children, so asylum-seeking backgrounds, asylum-seeking children, separated children. And I think there was a discussion, if we keep it simple, that we've got challenges. We've got challenges that are coming from America that are even here, that, as Antonia said, have always been here when we're thinking through the lens of race. But what we also have is legislation. we have the Equality Act, and it was sort of noted yesterday that actually, particularly thinking about it through the lens of foster carers and through our lens as social workers or the lenses of people that work for the public sector, that the Equality Act means we have to look through that lens and support not just our children and young people and communities, but also our staff members who may be experiencing discrimination, racism, inequity, and oppression, particularly if we look at that through the protected characteristic lens. So I think that was something to get people to really think about. The other thing that people seem to often forget, and it just brought it all back to light yesterday really, is that when you are experiencing racism, anti-Semitism, Muslim hate against the Muslim community, it's a hate crime. You can report it to the police. We have processes to report this, and the more people that report these issues as a hate crime, the more we can also tackle it really, and potentially think about how we can, well, I'm not going to say win this battle, but think about how we change this battle really, which is going to continue throughout my lifetime and beyond. But we have legislation that makes it clear about who we support, particularly looking through that protected characteristic lens. Sorry, I'm in a room that keeps with the light that keeps going out. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Millie. And we have time for one fairly quick question in the chat, which is about the disproportionality thematic audit. Was that Essex only, or was it regional? We're assuming it's just for Essex, that one.
Yes, it was just for Essex. So we looked at 31 different children from the global majority, and we looked at what outcomes did they receive, and how did racism shape that, and how does that influence how we've used safeguarding. And out of that came 8 recommendations, which I don't have to hand right now, but we looked at the fact that translators and interpreters weren't used where important. So at times racism wasn't responded to by social workers. So now we have this task and finish group really focused on embedding that learning into practice.
Brilliant. I think that's all the questions we have for the time being. If anyone thinks of something they'd like us to pass on to Antonia about her work in Essex, please do keep in touch. And also there's a link in the chat to Antonia's excellent paper in the British Journal of Social Work, which sets out this vision of transformational leadership, which she's been talking about. So fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, who is Tom Stibbs. Tom has been the Principal Social Worker for Children and Families for Brighton and Hove City Council for over 10 years. He's currently seconded to be the Families First Programme Director, and as Principal Social Worker he helped to develop the anti-racist project in Brighton and Hove, including chairing the project board and practice discussions and creating the anti-racist lead practitioner post. So welcome, Tom, and over to you.
Thank you, Rick, and hello to everybody. In terms of my presentation, I'm going to focus very much on the idea of turning words into action, and especially thinking about how we as white managers or white leaders or white practitioners take responsibility for turning anti-racist practice into action, and maybe the importance of that, but also the challenges of that. And I think it'll follow on really well from Antonia's presentation around transformational leadership and some of the ideas that Antonia shared. We've had an anti-racist project in Brighton and Hove since 2019, and up on the first slide there you can see an example of the action plan and the priority areas we had in 2024. If we can move to the next slide, please. I'm not going to talk too much around the anti-racist project, partly because I know it's been talked about in previous webinars in this series. Also, I've noticed there's quite a lot of Brighton and Hove colleagues on the webinar, and they'll obviously have to forgive me for hearing me talk about the project again, but hopefully they can take some of the discussion and ideas behind the project into the breakout areas as well. And I think the fact that there are so many of colleagues here as well show one of the key ideas behind culture change and the kind of commitment from practitioners. So it's really good to see people here. Very briefly, though, we've had the anti-racist project since 2019 in Children's Social Work Services, and it followed an audit of our work with Black and Global Majority families, which identified a number of failings in terms of how we assessed and supported Black and Global Majority families. And at the same time, we also had feedback from HR around the experience of Black and Global Majority staff within our service, and that they didn't always feel safe and supported. So we set up the Anti-Racist Project in 2019. You can see there a timeline and things like in 2020, we appointed anti-racist lead practitioner. In 2021, we were one of the local authorities that piloted the workforce race equality standards for social care. In 2022, we set up a Black and Global Majority practitioners group to support practitioners and provide peer support. And in 2023, we published an anti-racism strategy for the council. So that gives you an idea of some of the things we've done as part of the project. If we could move to the next slide, please. The aims of the project were about trying to challenge racism and to improve the experience of Black and Global Majority staff, to make our workforce more diverse and more representative of our community, and also to improve our practice with families. And you can see on this slide just a summary of some of the ways we might have made a difference. So we've, for instance, we've completed a survey with practitioners, and you can see some quotes there from practitioners about how the anti-racist work has maybe increased people's confidence, but has also had an impact on people in terms of their personal lives as well. And you can see that 86% of respondents said the project had made a difference. You can see as well that we've seen an increase in terms of Black and Global Majority staff. So, for instance, from 2021 to 2024, we saw an increase from 9 to 13% in terms of our staff overall, and from 7% to 13% for senior managers. And we've also seen improvements in the feedback from the audits that we completed with Black and Global Majority staff when we've rerun the audits in years since 2019. If we go to the next slide. So in terms of thinking about how change happens and how we put anti-racist practice into action, I think it's really important to emphasise that meaningful change relies upon change happening at 3 different levels. And I'm sure that many of you will have seen this model and are used to talking about the personal, cultural and structural levels. And I think it's really important today that I emphasise that actually this change also requires inclusive leadership, and inclusive leadership to be modelled by white leaders on all 3 levels. So just very quick examples of how we've maybe made change happen on each of these levels. First of all, in terms of on the personal level, and thinking about how we've done work on ourselves, one of the things that we've done is that the senior management team completed the Mean White Supremacy workbook by Layla Syed, and then that workbook was rolled out across our management teams and then across all of our teams in social work. On the cultural level, we've looked at our processes and how our process might support, for example, more inclusive recruitment. And so now in terms of recruitment, we have anonymised shortlisting, we have Black and Global Majority managers and practitioners part of all interview panels within social work. We have questions that are inclusive, and for example, we share questions with candidates before interviews. And then on the structural level, we've really thought about how our service is made up, and that's been part of the work of the RES, and really looking at our staffing and trying to shift the makeup of our staff, which you can see the statistics on the previous slide. In terms of the next slide, this kind of summarises what I think some of the key messages are in terms of what inclusive leadership looks and feels like, and some of the key messages for white managers and white leaders in terms of inclusive leadership. So it's really important that white leaders are visible in terms of doing this work, and that they need to acknowledge and recognise feelings of anxiety around the work, but to actually make sure that they do something and don't allow those feelings of discomfort to prevent them doing the work. And in terms of doing something, it's also really important to recognise that you might get things wrong, but that shouldn't stop you taking action. obviously, and Antonia and Millie have already talked really eloquently about the impact of systemic racism, and we're not going to change that overnight. But actually, that doesn't mean that we don't do something and that we don't take action as white leaders within social care services. In terms of recognising when we got things wrong, one example of that from our own experience is when we first set up the Anti-Racist Project, we actually called it a diversity steering group, and we quickly realised that that was a misstep. I think we were initially thinking, well, we would address issues around racism within a few months and then maybe move on and address issues around gender or around sexuality. And we quickly realised that we needed to be really clear and explicit about the work we were doing and that it was focused around racism. And we also, and again, as Antonia has talked about, we needed to recognise that it was a long-term project and would be focusing on racism. Again, we really need to recognise the impact on Black and global majority staff, and that wasn't necessarily something we did initially in terms of thinking about the impact of the anti-racism work on Black and global majority colleagues, and so that's why we set up the Black and global majority practitioners group. It's really important as leaders we keep communicating about the work, keep talking about the work that we're doing, including the work on self, and recognising it's really important that we do that work and keep turning up to do the work. And it's really important that we, as well as doing the work ourselves, kind of share access and opportunity for Black and global majority colleagues and really think about allyship and knowing where to stand. And that's something that Millie and I have discussed quite a bit, and just kind of thinking about there's times when I, as a white leader, need to kind of step forward and be really visible in terms of doing the work around anti-racist practice. There might be other times when it's really important that I stand alongside colleagues like Millie and kind of demonstrate that as a white leader I'm standing alongside my Black colleagues to do this work together. And then there may be other times when it's important for me to take a step backwards as a white leader and to allow Black and global majority colleagues to lead work and to take have the positive feedback around the work they're doing. And then a final key message that I'll emphasise today is about who's responsible for anti-racist practice and making sure that action happens. I think it's really important that we recognise and acknowledge that white silence and discomfort underpin racism, and that as white leaders and white workers and as white people, we're really responsible for making sure that anti-racist practice happens. And as white leaders, we really need to model allyship. A key bit in terms of turning words into action is that we don't centre the discomfort of white managers. And if I give a quick example of that, when we did a significant service redesign in children's social work in Brighton in 2015, and as part of that, as principal social worker, I completed an equalities impact assessment, which highlighted that, excuse me, that assessment highlighted that we didn't have equality in terms of the number of Black and global majority workers within our service, but it also highlighted concerns around those workers' experience within our service. I presented that kind of feedback to our management group, and at that time we weren't able to acknowledge those issues and to take the findings of those assessment forward. However, when we came to have the same discussions in 2019 as a group, we were able to move away from centering our own discomfort and actually to take action based on those concerns. So it's kind of an example about the impact of centering their own comfort for white managers, and that actually in order to turn words into action that we really need to be able to move away from that position. I do have a last slide which I'll mention very quickly because I'm running over time. Obviously, a key part of the Families First reforms that are happening at the moment, we're really working in terms of trying to make sure that we embed the work we're doing around anti-racist practice and really trying to spread that message and use the opportunity of the Families First reforms, which are really based around multi-agency working and integrated family help teams, to try and make sure that we spread anti-racist practice across services within Brighton and Hove. But I should stop there because apologies, I've gone slightly over time, and apologies for coughing during my presentation as well.
Thanks ever so much, Tom. And no, you're not over time at all. In fact, you're just on time. Because of us wanting to allow some space for reflective discussion in the breakout rooms, we we can't offer a slot for Tom to answer questions, but I'm sure his presentation has provoked some reflections, including I can see in the chat a really insightful reflection from Deborah about how anti-racist practice goes beyond white leaders and black practitioners to encompass the whole workforce and the whole organisation, and I'm sure that's going to come up in the groups and the questions that Millie has curated for us to consider. So if you do have any queries and comments you'd like us to pass on to Tom, please do send them our way. And it just remains for me to thank you ever so much, Tom. It's just really impressive work as we know in Brighton and Hove, and we look forward to hearing what comes next as well. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to introduce Millie, who probably needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Thank you ever so much. Millie is a strategic anti-racist lead for Brighton Hove City Council. She's been supporting and developing anti-racist strategic action planning, systems and culture change for years across children's and learning development services. Her ongoing career objectives are to continue to enhance anti-racist practice, racial and social justice nationally. And Millie is also a member of BASW's Children's Families Thematic Group and the Racial Justice Family Network, chaired by Coram Bath. So over to you, Millie.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction there, Rick. So yes, I think lots of what I'm probably going to touch on has been touched on a little bit already by Antonia and Tom. But I think a big part of this session, people often asked about, well, actually, how do we do this work? How do we do it in action? How do we have these conversations amongst ourselves? And how do we begin to have these conversations with our Black and global majority children and families, thinking through the lens of culture, identity, religion, and all of those sorts of issues, all born out of the Racism and Safeguarding Panel Review report. So what I've done is to get people to think about some of these issues and think about what this might look like for you in your organisation and in terms of your practice and in terms of your confidence around thinking about this work, your confidence in terms of thinking about how you have discussions about race in terms of your peer groups and staff group, and think about inclusion through that lens, as well as thinking about, well, actually, how do you really have these conversations, think about these conversations, reflect on some of these issues in terms of how you engage with our Black and global majority children and families yourself. And if you're not confident, what will aid your confidence? If you're fearful, what is making it fearful? If you feel you need more support, what support is it you feel you actually need from your leaders, from your peers and your senior leaders within your organisation? So next slide, please. So I've posed two questions. This is question one, which I want people. You're going to go into breakout groups. I can read those questions if you like. You're going into breakout groups and you'll get a different question. Some people have the same question. Some people have question two. So as a practitioner, this is what I want people to actually think about. How can you feel empowered to have conversations with children and families about race, identity, and particularly when you are working with individuals from cultural and ethnic backgrounds that may be different to your own, and particularly when you're thinking about this through the lens of safeguarding and your safeguarding partnerships too, how can you create conditions that empower practitioners to do this effectively? So very much thinking about how you can begin to have these conversations really in the first instance. Second slide, please. The second question, I could not just have one because I thought it'd be quite a rich presentation if we actually thought about how people think about this more widely in terms of some of the discussions and what might come back in terms of some of the reflections. But how do you ensure you are self-reflective about your own biases? And I'm very much in agreement with Antonia around this. When we talk about anti-racist practice, when we talk about difference, when we talk about how we can be inclusive and talk about how we may actually really be listening or not, as the case may be sometimes, around the needs of our Black and global majority young people, unwittingly or otherwise, a lot of our decision makings can sometimes be impacted by our biases, our beliefs and stereotypes that are held about different communities, different religions and different cultures. And these are compounded, I would argue, I'll say it as it is, in terms of what can feel like our present hostile climate that we're living in. And I'd say, yes, things go backwards and forwards all the time, but we're always fighting a battle, I would say, around race equality and inclusion. So this work cannot even begin until we are able to think about our own biases, our own beliefs and our stereotypes and where they come from. So the second question is very much getting you to think about that in the breakout session. How do you ensure you are self-reflective about your own biases when working with children and families from diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds? And how is this supported on an individual level in terms of thinking about that in terms of your own learning and within your teams and organizations? And as a safeguarding partnership as well, how do you reassure yourselves that your team and providing reflective space, your team are providing reflective spaces for practitioners to explore these issues? And that's a big question for me, and I'll talk about this more at the end of my brief presentation, is what does reflective spaces look like within your service and organisation? And if there aren't real reflective spaces to think about this, what could reflective spaces to have these safe stroke brave conversations look like? What would they look like? So these are the first things I want you to think about first in the next 10 minutes or so. Is that okay? So people are going to be going into breakout rooms, then I'm going to get people to come back in and hear your reflections around these questions.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. I think just checking my schedule to make sure I don't interfere with the plan. And I think the plan is to hand back to Millie. Millie, let me know if I'm wrong. But I think everyone's joined the main room now, so it's back over to you.
Yeah, should we? It was very long. Questions that they had in terms of the discussions they may have had groups. But any sort of one thing takeaway from thinking about these questions, and these are important questions because they actually come from the It's Silent panel review for everyone to think about in terms of social work practice and in terms of safeguarding partnerships. So any thoughts?
Feedback from our group, Millie. Okay. So just really quickly, because I know it's only like one line, but I suppose the key message probably that came out of our discussions was the importance of really delving deep in terms of what somebody's culture actually is, and that the ethnicity sometimes isn't, it's very surface level. People aren't doing that deeper dive into what it actually means for individuals. And an example was given of, if somebody's described as Caribbean, but actually not actually asking the questions, which island, etc., which would have very significant differences in terms of what might, be relevant for that individual. So there were just some of the examples. I won't go into there's lots more discussion, but I know you want us to be succinct. So that was probably the key things, being curious and being specific.
Thank you. I could probably speak to a lot, but that's really, really important. When you put Black African, when you put Black Caribbean, you need to break it down and be more specific. We're not a homogenous group, and we need to be mindful of that when we're thinking about some of this work in terms of thinking through the lens of how you break it down and actually get more detail about someone's culture and their traditions, where there might be nuances and slight differences. Thank you, Denise. Andrew?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else from our group wants to feedback, but the point that I thought was really well made was that it's also about employers making sure they give time for social workers to have these conversations. If you're expecting somebody to work through this, to explore someone's identity, etc., the appropriate time and tools for doing that, but actually really importantly the time and the workload so that it makes it realistic to be able to do this and to explore identity appropriately is really important, and employers partnerships really need to make sure that they're giving people that space to have those conversations.
Thank you very much. And that's really, really important for us to even begin to think about how we progress this work, begin to think about how we improve the lives and outcomes of our Black and global majority children and young adults, I would argue. It's thinking about how we create those spaces for social workers to learn about those differences, for social workers to have discussions really about some of those things they might not be comfortable with or confident with or fearful of. And if you're not creating those reflective spaces to have those conversations and grow and learn, there will be challenges in terms of how we actually really think about how we're supporting our Black and global majority children and families. And there's a saying I always say, you know, sometimes you often hear, oh, well, that community or that culture are difficult to engage. I believe nobody, absolutely nobody is difficult to engage. It's about how we engage. And sometimes that how means we need to think about how we go out to our communities rather than always expecting people to come to us. But we really need to have those reflective conversations, reflective spaces to think about and move away from, oh, those communities or that culture or whatever it might be are difficult to engage, because they're not. Thank you. Rick.
Yeah, one quite interesting reflection from people in our group is that the what's taught on social work courses seems to have changed. And so people even who qualified 5-6 years ago were saying there wasn't very much reflection about anti-racist practice or practical tools. You know, they just wasn't there. And yet people who've qualified more recently, including on the short courses like Think Ahead, you know, fast track courses, are saying that they get lots of material and lots of opportunities to reflect. They bring that then into their workplace and they expect it to be there. Which in some cases, of course, it is, places like Brighton, for example, but not everywhere. And that then can create a dissonance where you've got a culture where these forums are not there, the spaces are not there, and then it's often then led to the newly qualified workers who expect it to kind of be doing something about it, which can be challenging. So yes, it's an interesting question.
Thank you very much for that. And I am aware, I think things have improved on some university courses, but I'm aware that it can still be quite sporadic, really, in terms of where people might go as to how much or how little training or support they may get around thinking around anti-racist practice. But I think that's the reason why there are spaces like this and other areas that people can actually think about how they move some of this work on. And actually, I sort of was a bit of a bystander in the breakout room that you were in, and I think a point was raised, and it's really, really important point, I suppose, that we can often speak through the lens of social workers that may be coming to local authority social work, but there are lots of people as well who may go into other organisations, like, I don't know, you could be a social worker in education, or you could be a social worker working for a charity or other areas, professional areas. And what does that look like? How are people able to support their learning, if you like, and their support around thinking through an anti-racist lens, particularly if there are challenges in terms of how that organisational culture and that leadership may think about it. Well, there's a few points I'll raise going forward around this in my slides, but thank you very much. Okay, next slide, and we'll hopefully have a few minutes for questions. Please, thank you. So really, that activity was to get people to think about how you not just reflect, how you grow in confidence, how you overcome fear in terms of talking to children and families about race, about racism, and issues that impact them in terms of their culture and in terms of their identity, and how we grow in confidence, I would say, to have these conversations beyond a tick box. The session I did yesterday, for example, focused on what can be the thinking around, oh, well, I'm thinking about culture, I'm thinking about identity in my assessments, in my work, in my foster placements, because I'm providing halal meat, or I'm providing kosher meals, or I am making sure I'm directing young people to their faith organisation or to their mosque. It is much, much more than that. It's some of the discussions we had in one of the groups I was listening to is about how you grow in confidence to challenge, how you grow in confidence to have conversations, how you grow in confidence to have deeper conversations around how a young person may feel about their identity, about their culture, and about their traditional norms, and how we may even challenge families around some of these issues. Really, example I've also given is how do we also work with white parents who may be raising mixed heritage Black children where there may be no Black extended family members involved in their life. And I don't know, a white parent might think, oh, all this talk about racism is just making things worse. How do you then work with that white parent, that Black mixed heritage child to get everyone to think about their identity? But when we're thinking about creating brave spaces for uncomfortable conversations that actually lead to action, a lot of the things that I've just put here briefly mirror some of the things that Antonia's already raised and mirror some of the things that Tom has already raised. But one of the key things that's come out of these 3 webinars is people wanted examples. So in terms of the discussions, sorry, my light keeps going off, 1 second. No, I'll keep going. In terms of some of the examples that people wanted really around what it looks like in practice. No, 1 second, I need to turn the light back on. Apologies, I'm in a room with a light that's on a timer. But one of the things you need to think about, and some of this has already been touched on, is thinking about how you have discussions and enable the discussions in one-to-ones, in supervisions around race, around any challenges social workers may be having around engagement, how you enable them to reflect not just on the casework actually, but how you enable your staff members to also focus on how they are feeling about some of the work that they're doing. You can also have and think about how you create space if you don't already have spaces in terms of having discussions like group supervisions, team meetings. I'm mindful when I've done some training around this before for other organisations, they've not had any reflective spaces to have these discussions, even if you just set aside, I'll say 15 minutes minimum, but no, at least half an hour for team meetings. Think about how you can have discussions within these spaces and reflective discussion spaces to even bring maybe a family or a young person to actually discuss what may be an issue for people, because this is how people grow in confidence. Think about how you make sure, even if you just have one thing on social workers, PDPs or appraisals, professional development plans around how you're going to enhance anti-racist practice. It could be just coming to a session like this today or reading a book or webinar as one thing. We've done lots of work which you can think about. There's a lot of self-learning people have to do because, as I said, it starts with self, but there's stuff that we've also done in Brighton and Hove where we've looked at workshops and specific workshops to sort of enhance people's learning and understanding, with some examples being around what is adultification, what is microaggressions, which we are moving to call everyday racism, working with Black and Muslim dads, because there's maybe fear or confidence or stereotypes about Black dads, which has moved to be fair, on monthly sessions on how everyone works with dads. As well as right now, we're doing a series of training around racial trauma and what that looks like through a Black and global majority lens. Tom has touched on, we have support groups. We also now in the local authority, any student or ASYE that comes to us, they go through a series of anti-racist learning sessions with us. We very much think about the support needs of our international social workers and make sure we're listening to their voices and ensure we're thinking about how we're supporting them better. Linked to our Black and global majority support group. We have an anti-racist strategy, which is just for children's services. We have an anti-racist strategy that covers the whole council. And part of my role now as strategic lead is not just looking at children's services, but looking at how we spread the work across the whole council through the lens of strategy, which might be, for example, we still need to do better, particularly if we think for a wider lens, not always children's families, about how we think about ethnicity recording, just as one example. Senior leadership buy-in is critical. Tom touched on that. We have dedicated anti-racist lead and strategic lead positions in this local authority around education, my role, as well as equality, diversity and inclusion leads. And we have a project board as well as the communities of practice that feeds into our action plans and strategies, that looks at the gaps that still remain, which are frequently gaps. I know one of the other things we could be looking at would be around how we support managers to support social workers and their teams around anti-racism discussions, for example. We've also provided anti-racist, and we continue to provide anti-racist training for our foster carers, as well as we've provided black skin and hair workshop, but particularly the black hair workshops, because it still remains a challenge, particularly as many of our young people are in biracial foster placements. It's enabling foster carers as well as white kinship carers as well to think about how they prepare black and mixed heritage young people's hair in their care. And don't have time to talk about this now, but a big part of the work now is also thinking about how we spread some of the work we're doing around anti-racist practice through our multi-agency partners. And we've had conferences and more recently joined up training with the police, in particular looking at identification and stop and search impacted by particularly our black and mixed heritage children, which is going really well, which I'm pleased to say. And we are looking at another joint police and adolescent youth justice service training coming up in June. Next slide, please. So, as Tom and others and Antonia has touched on, leaders have a pivotal role in addressing discrimination and bias and in creating climate and conditions that supports active, conscious and consistent anti-racist practice. This necessarily involves multi-agency leaders and practitioners recognising and confronting racism, biases, stereotypes and discriminatory practices so that the importance of these issues is recognised and addressed. Importantly, this involves naming and identifying racism as an issue when it occurs or has been a consideration. Next slide, please. I don't expect people to answer this now. You can maybe think about putting something in the chat quickly in the next minute or so as we sort of wind up this session. But how confident do you feel as an individual to name and challenge racism? Alternatively, what would support your growth in confidence and in growing in confidence to challenge racism? So just think about that question for a second, and maybe you can think about it after this session, but also maybe if you are able to, maybe just give some thought to this question in the chat. And my final slide, I hope, is this. We talked a lot about the climate we're in. It's a hostile climate. We're in this profession for a reason. So we must not let fear divide us. We must not let fear not enable us to think about how we are more inclusive, how we think about the identity of our children, how we do our absolute best to make sure we improve the lives and outcomes of our Black and global majority children. So in the words of Reverend Jesse James, who passed away last week, at the end of the day, we must go forward with hope and not backward by fear and division, which threatens to impact our work today. So I always use these quotes to empower me, no matter what I'm faced with in this hostile environment. Thank you. And I would just say, we may have time for one or two questions if people have any questions they wish to raise.
Thank you, Millie.
Thank you.
Probably people will have all sorts of questions they would like to ask, and we have 2 minutes available. But well, I think just to say thanks ever so much, Millie, and everyone that's contributed to today. And I'd really like to thank our speakers, Antonia and Tom, as well as Millie Kerr. And just to say, this is the final session in this particular webinar series, but it's not the end. So we're hoping that this will be a continuation point really for continuing the conversation. There are many initiatives and strategic actions being taken all around the country. And I'm hoping that people who attended these webinars and contributed to the conversations today will join us for future events. And what we have experienced and heard from is insights on the journey that colleagues in Essex and Brighton have been on to develop and consolidate anti-racist strategies. to build those structures and buy-in from different parts of the council and their regions. And it's highlighted the importance of creating opportunities to share, you know, these stories, these inspirational stories of good practice, but also to identify how much still needs to be done, and create that template really, and concrete steps that can be taken as a way of giving hope to people who are working in organisations that aren't as far advanced. So look out for future events on this, and please do send us updates on what's happening in your areas and ideas for other things that we might be able to bring to the table to add to the perspectives that we've heard today and in the last two sessions. It's clearly an ambitious undertaking. We face problematic political climate in some respects, but as Millie has pointed out, you know, we have the law on our side and the majority of social work on our side, and there is much that can be done and is being done. So so please do help and support, and next time we do one of these things, it won't be necessary to have Millie and Antonio and Tom doing the lion's share of the work, because we'll have so much to choose from in terms of other strategies and initiatives all around the country. So tempting really to leave the last word to Jessie Jackson and to Millie. Millie, do you want the last word before we close?
Say, well, don't give up, because we're living in a climate where, you know, I think there is a sense that there is division and there is people trying to cause division. And as I said, I think we all need to go forward with hope, really, for brighter days and a better future, because in many ways we've not, for those of us who from Black and global majority backgrounds in particular, we've been here before. And yes, it feels really stark, it feels really, really bad, but we have to focus on not just ourselves and how we continue to grow and learn, but focus on how we're going to support the children and families that we're working with, and young people actually who are going to be the adults of our future. So we have to keep going. We have to focusing on enabling our children that we're working with, and even our own children, to also focus on hope and brighter days. Children are our future. So I'll leave everyone with that, really.
Thank you.